section 1 of SOSI with the origins of the Cold War. Last time we talked about clashing ideals. This time we're going to talk about what happened to get us to the U.S.-Soviet wartime alliance and what happened during the war. And this is probably the last section that I would really consider the kind of, well, it's not the last section, maybe the penultimate section of the kind of prelude to the Cold War. The next section is going to be kind of about the wartime and post-war meetings that Stalin, Churchill, and then Roosevelt and later Truman will have. And those actually, to me, do feel like they're kind of part of the Cold War in a sense. Like it's almost like they're kind of trying to maneuver around and figure out, where the battle lines are going to be. But so we got to talk about first off the basis of the U.S.-Soviet wartime alliance, and then the experience both countries had during the war. And hopefully during this time, I will be able to kind of use a map to show you guys some of the battles to maybe help get a better feel of those and go into some detail on some things that you may not know too much of. So obviously, the Allied powers are going to be Britain, U.S., Soviet Union, and then any of their kind of compatriots. The one they didn't have to mention, but should be mentioned is ANZAC, which is the Australia, New Zealand, and Canada forces, which are also a big part of the D-Day invasion. But yeah, so Britain, U.S., and the Soviet Union fight between 1941 and 1945 against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Now, all three of these countries actually really pretty much do have the same form of government, which is fascism. Imperial Japan, maybe a little bit less so, but in the early 30s, late 20s, because of the Great Depression, there was a big political fallout in Japan that led to the military takeover of the government. But they're the three major nations. Of course, there's other countries on their side as well. The U.S. enters the war last, like they did in World War I. And the only reason they entered is the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. We'll go into more detail on that a little bit later when they talk about the U.S. wartime experience. But this they don't really go into the reason why this happened. Well, hopefully I'll be able to explain a little bit why Japan made that decision. Because just without any context, it seems dumb, but there's a reason for what they did. And by that time that the United States had joined, Great Britain had already been at war for Germany for more than 2 years, including the bombing campaigns by the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force in the second half of 1940, which is known as the Battle of Britain, where radar helped the British kind of stave off the German forces. As well as, of course, the British Air Force being incredibly good against the Germans. The Soviets, at this point, though, had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in August of 1939. That was mentioned in the previous section. They did that to, again, give them some space to grow and economically, and basically they kind of thought that they would be able to reap some of the rewards. Basically, the idea was that they were going to split Poland and then kind of split Eastern Europe for the most part. And after this, they quickly conquer Finland in the Winter War of 1939-1940, which for those of you who don't know, and we're going to be using this map here a bit, Russia and Finland, very close neighbors, right? So it was very easy for them to kind of just walk in and take it over. Not easy per se. The Finns did put up a fight, but they were able to take it over in the Winter War. However, the reason that Hitler signed this non-aggression pact is not an alliance, right? They're not allied to each other. It's simply a pact that says we will not attack each other, but we're not going to help each other out. Hitler did this to prevent a two-front war, which is what in the end kind of doomed the Germans in World War I to an extent. It was also the Americans kind of coming in at the last kind of part there and pushing with their material and their soldiers and stuff like that. So June 22nd, 1941, Hitler launches a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union, ending the Nazi-Soviet pact. And this is a complete surprise. The Russians had no idea this, or the Soviets had no idea this was going to happen. So for the big three, we see these unexpected events lead to a wartime alliance that frankly isn't, it's an alliance that, again, is of necessity. However, of the big three, the British and the Americans very clearly the closest due to their common culture, their shared economic interests, and the democratic institutions they shared. The U.S.-Soviet alliance, meanwhile, and the British-Soviet alliance depended basically on their shared hatred of the Nazis, right? And to kind of go into more detail on the fact that like this is very clearly not like a friendly alliance. For 11 years after the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922, the U.S. refuses to recognize them, with diplomatic ties only finally being established in 1933. And you're going to see the U.S. do this as well with communist China. Despite, of course, though, 11 years they don't listen, they don't, accept them as the true rulers. Relations are going to be pretty tense even after they do. The U.S., in fact, suspects the Soviets of trying to foment revolution within the United States, which is absolutely true. Whereas the Soviets viewed the U.S. as an unforgiving capitalist nation, also helped try to bring the Tsar back into power during the Russian Civil War in the early 1920s. And as one historian said, the Soviet-American alliance was forged from the bare metal of national self-interest. Sorry, I think I need to put that hyphen in a different place. Do that. And of course, when these interests diverge, once World War II is over, the alliance just snaps in half, right? There's no alliance once the war is over. The strategic logic, in fact, of this wartime alliance makes the Cold War almost appear inevitable, right? They're just, despite being allies at this point, they're just so clearly different, right? And so to kind of go into why they turned into bitter rivals, we need to understand what happened in the war. And so we start with the American wartime experience. The U.S. is incredibly isolationist at this point. They did not want to join World War II for a very long time, specifically because of their experience in World War I, where in World War I, they were originally promised they would never join the war by Woodrow Wilson. He campaigned for president that said we will not join the war. He kept us out of war, I believe was the actual campaign slogan. But when they joined the war, it was based on like a higher moral standing, right? Doing the right thing, helping out their allies, helping out people who are like-minded around the world. And so Americans were pretty upset with Wilson's old morality-based internationalism, right? Which really comes to play in the 14 points with things like the League of Nations and self-determination, right? Stuff like that. And the Americans are very cautious of involving their nation in foreign conflicts, right? And that really intensifies with the Great Depression. The Great Depression starts in the United States, caused by both farm failures and rampant speculation on the stock market. The farm failures were due to World War I. In World War I, when you have most of Europe unable to farm, the United States increases their farming output, not just the United States, but places like Argentina as well. And then when Europe recovers, goes back to farming, right? Maybe not as much as they were, but still farming a lot more than they were during the war. The United States, Argentina, other countries don't scale back, right? They don't decrease the amount they are producing. And so what that leads to is way too much supply of the market, which leads to downward prices around the world. And then on top, so we see a lot of farmers have to close up their farms, have to sell their farms or go bankrupt and default on their mortgages. And then what happens is that the banks who had loaned them those mortgages, they will collapse because they took the mortgage, they basically took that money from the farmers used money from other investors to give to the farmers for these loans. But now the money's disappeared. And so when people try to go to the bank, their money isn't there, leading to bank runs, leading to massive catastrophe of the economy. And then on top of that, a lot of wild stock market trading that I frankly don't know enough about to get into leads to the collapse in 1929, I think. And so the Great Depression, why does the Great Depression lead to isolationism? Well, another thing about the Great Depression is that when the United States hits the Great Depression, immediately what they decide to do, or one of the things they decide to do, is sign the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which basically was the biggest tariff bill of all time. It still might be, but it basically forbade other countries from trading with the United States, which at the time they thought was the right thing to do, but John Maynard Keynes had not come around yet and kind of, put some sense into government officials. And so that actually made the depression worse, right? Because it shut off most of the market to them. But isolationism is gaining a lot of momentum in the 1930s, right? This idea of like protecting America from this worldwide depression that they started. And an opinion poll in 1936 showed 95% of respondents now want to take part in another war in Europe. So I just want to I don't know, I don't know if the like science of poll taking was where it is today in World War in the Great Depression. I highly doubt it was, but for 95% of people to agree with one platform is insane. Like that is crazy. So that shows you how widespread isolationism is. Like anytime you see a poll nowadays, like when you see something that's 60% approval or 60% disapproval, that's a big deal. Right, that's like a clear victory or defeat for whoever, whatever happened in the poll. Right, so for 95% of people to be isolationist is a lot. In fact, we have isolationist groups like the American First Committee, track hundreds of thousands of members, including the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. I love that they brought this little fact up. Charles Lindbergh, I watched recently the Plot Against America. Great little series on HBO. And it really brought home how popular Charles Lindbergh was. Charles Lindbergh, first person to, I believe, cross the Atlantic or something like that, or fly around the world, one of those things. But he was revered as a hero in the United States. And so for him to be part of this America First Committee, which is not an isolationist, is really xenophobic, right? He's anti-foreigners in general. Right, speaks to how popular and widespread isolationism and xenophobia was in the United States at this point. And because of this, Congress responds to 95%. They're going to respond, and they passed 4 neutrality acts between 1935 and 1939. However, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, instantaneously, immediately, it shifts. Right, the idea shifts about going to war. And we saw this in the modern times in 2001 with the September 11th attacks. Before that, the United States was not really looking to intervene in other wars. We were looking to kind of play a role through the UN, right, with places like in the Balkans and to a lesser extent Somalia, right, and places like that, right. We were trying to play our role through the United Nations. And maybe kind of be the head of that. But with 2001, with 9/11, that changed that idea of going to war, and all of a sudden war seemed much more favorable. Same thing with Pearl Harbor. Real quick, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? Mainly because the United States had embargoed Japan for oil, basically not trading any oil to them, and really because they didn't trade any oil to them, a lot of people weren't going to trade oil to them. And so Japan was running out of resources to continue to produce and make their military go, which also led to them expanding in East Asia quite a bit, right, into places like the Philippines, later on into places like Southeast Asia, right, Indonesia, those kind of places. They will invade those places to get those resources. But basically, the Japanese leadership recognized that they were at kind of like a break point, right? They had to get oil. Right, and they had to. They felt that also that America joining was inevitable, and so they needed to be able to surprise the Americans, destroy their Pacific fleet to the point that they could not really participate in a Pacific theater, and Japan could just roll up this huge empire before America could really do anything about it. And hopefully by that time, either the war in Europe was won and the Germans could come help, or Japan was just in such a dominant position it wouldn't matter. Which was the big mistake that the Japanese made here, was that actually most of the aircraft carriers, which the aircraft carriers being essentially floating islands, right? They spread air superiority. They were not at Pearl Harbor that day, so none of the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were there. So it was a calculated decision on the Japanese behalf. Obviously, it failed, but that's why they did it, right? They were running out of resources, and they basically made the calculation that if we do this right now, if we destroy their fleet, we can get to the resources in time to build up our military to put in a fight with America, and help Germany in the process. So yeah, Congress votes unanimously, almost unanimously, I should say unanimously, almost unanimously to authorize America's entry into the war the next day. And isolationism is done in the United States, frankly, forever. And by the end of the war in August 1945, we see 16 million men and women serve in the war, whether in the military or I wonder if they mean in factories as well. But maybe that's just in the military. 16 million men and women. That's probably just in the military. 18.1% of American families had at least one member who served in the armed forces, which is a staggering amount. If you have four neighbors, one of you has somebody fighting the war. And the big thing about World War II, and to a lesser extent World War I, but certainly World War II, is that World War II really is it's cited as the biggest reason for the U.S. getting out of the Great Depression. FDR had done a lot of help with his social programs, but the United States was pretty much out of the Depression at this time. I think the idea that it got them out of the Great Depression is maybe a little too simple, but I think what it did is that, if the American economy was here before the Great Depression and dropped down to here during the Great Depression, and maybe they were kind of close back to where they were, at this point. But what World War II allows them to do is introduce an economy the United States had never seen before, and frankly, never seen again. It is a machine of an economy. They mobilize vast manufacturing capacity, right? Their massive agricultural production and massive technological development, all because this war demanded it, right? In the name of total war being this concept of war using every resource of a society, right? And from 1942 to 1945, the U.S. outpaced all other nations in the production of vehicles. In 1944, they show America producing 600,000 trucks, with Germany only producing 88,000, which maybe has something to do with the fact that they probably have been bombing their industrial centers at this point. Who knows? But also, that is a monstrous difference. Tanks, ships, and aircraft. They talk about the U.S. producing 209, almost 300,000 aircraft. Whereas Japan only produced 69,910, and 2 times as much more than Britain and Germany, which again is staggering that the United States entered the war 2 years after it started and did all this, right? It is truly amazing, right? And the American industrial production was the envy of everybody else. And once the war ended, right? They're talking about the envy of the world in peacetime. Maybe in the 20s. Not in the 30s, though, certainly. After World War I, the United States did become one of the powers of the world, but they were still on the level of countries like Britain and mostly Britain. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it in hindsight, I think they were kind of considered to be the major power at that point because Britain and France were in particular in debt to the Americans. And America's wartime economy reduced unemployment, it boosted wages, and provided the basis for a sustained period of post-war prosperity, basically through all of the 50s, maybe even into the 60s a little bit. And it's actually one of the big kind of, I feel like World War II economically it's kind of this double-edged sword for the United States. Massive economic boost. It's incredible what the economy did during World War II. But at the same time, it's kind of laid this expectation of this economy being the American economy when really it wasn't. And you can even make the argument that's why maybe some people push for war a little more often is to help to kind of recreate that idea. Because it's also happened in World War I. During World War I, the United States was an economic powerhouse because of the war. And in fact, there's a lot of theories that the reason we joined World War I is because weapon manufacturers kind of forced Woodrow Wilson into it. So yeah, again, World War II helped solidify the U.S. as the world's dominant economy once the war is over. So for the U.S., there are 2 major theaters. We have the Atlantic Ocean, or the Atlantic Theater, where there are 2 major fronts. I'm going to pull this up here. We start with the Northern Africa and southern Italy front, right? So trying to get, they considered Italy to be the weak underbelly of Europe, which, by the way, at this point, Germany controls, the Nazis control all of mainland Europe for the most part. So they're trying to get through to Italy. They consider the Italians to kind of be the weak underbelly here. And in fact, they kind of are. The Germans have to send soldiers to protect Italy, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? And so that was the major focus at first. Again, North Africa is a staging point for the invasion of southern Italy. And then in June of 1944, June 6th, 1944, Americans land in Normandy. Right, we got Utah, we got Pont du Hoc. Sorry, where's Omaha? There's Omaha. We got Utah, we got Omaha, we got the general kind of area right here: Gold Beach, Juneau, and Sword Beach. So 5 different beaches. The United States, I think, had these 2, had Utah and Omaha. And then the British, and I think the British only had 1, and then the Anzac troops maybe had 2. I forget what the exact order was there. So that's them entering. So again, Fortress Europa. The Germans had full control of continental Europe at this point, and so they're opening a 3rd front at this point. And so after successfully landing at the Normandy D-Day invasions in June 1944, they quickly sweep through France and Belgium, make their way into Germany, and help defeat the Nazis in May of 1945. In the Pacific, America leads a large-scale campaign to defeat Japan and its empire in a strategy called island hopping. Islands in the Pacific were incredibly important, mostly as bases for airplanes. But at this time, while both fronts were going on, the Pacific only had 50% of total American war effort. Again, the brutal fighting against the Japanese on small islands. Again, these islands are important because they serve as aircraft locations. Sorry, I was trying to see if that map had any Asia stuff. It does not. And then at the same time, once they got close enough, which is super key, I think once they got to Okinawa, maybe a little further away, they started bombing mainland Japan on a constant basis, basically leveling Japanese cities. And of course, this culminates with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, leading to the unconditional surrender of the Japanese. So the U.S. only lost 405,399 soldiers in World War II. I say only because we'll talk when I say only here in a little bit. It's greater than their losses in World War I, but significantly lower than all other nations fighting. And with the exception of Pearl Harbor, no real attacks on America, right? No cities are bombed, the industrial infrastructure is fine, right? And because of this, the U.S. emerges from this war in better shape than any other nation on Earth. And in fact, they're the only nation in possession of atomic weapons, right? Making the U.S. not only a superpower, but possibly the superpower. But the Soviets have different ideas. For the Soviets, World War II was the Great Patriotic War. And the trauma and also the success of the war leaves a massive impression upon the Soviets, not only the citizens, but also the leaders. Soviet cash. Okay. This is why this is small. 29 million Soviets died in the war effort. 6.2 million are killed, 19 million injured or incapacitated. Incapacitated can mean lots of things. It can be mentally incapacitated, physically incapacitated, right? Lots of things is what that means. And then 4.4 million missing or captured. And 84% of the Soviet men and women mobilized were killed, wounded, or captured. 84%. If you join the war effort, you have an 84% chance of not making it out, or at least making it out severely wounded. And these don't include the civilian deaths that happened due to sieges, specifically, as well as Soviet citizens who were killed by the Soviet government, which, as all told, that could increase the number to by 17 million. So we could be looking at 46 million dead overall during World War II for the Soviets, which is an astronomical number, right? If you think about that in the United States, that's like 15% of our population, right? That is massive. Nearly every Soviet family lost a relative, and the demographic loss depleted the Soviets for an entire generation. So they still have a gender imbalance to this day, which is crazy. We see deprivation and barbarity of those that are either trapped in occupied territory or besieged cities. And in Leningrad/St. Petersburg, we see starvation leading to the eating of wallpaper, eating of shoes, eating of dogs, and eventually human flesh. And in the villages and cities of Eastern Europe and the Baltic, Nazis and Soviets carried out pretty awful atrocities, summary executions and mass rape. Of course, not to say anything about the Nazis in the final solution with the Jews, the chemical extermination, physical extermination of the Jews living in Eastern Europe. While the war brought suffering to the Soviets, at the same time, it also felt as justification for their way of life, right? Their ideological mission is accomplished, right? They are clearly superior because the people won this war, right? At great cost, right? But the people won that war. And in fact, the war officially begins for the Soviets with the betrayal of Hitler. So basically, it sounds like the Winter War they don't consider part of World War II. It's like its own thing. His Wehrmacht, Wehrmacht being the German name for army, or at least Hitler's army, attacked the Soviets' Western Front in June 1941. So about 7 months before the United States in Pearl Harbor. And the German tanks rolled through Eastern Europe, specifically the Baltic states and Ukraine and Belarus, which if we take a look here, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Is this Estonia? Right? Yeah. No, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. What's this? Oh, is this Belarus? That's more Belarus. Yeah, that's the other part of Belarus, right? Yeah, I think that's how that works. So they roll through those and into the Russian heartland, and within a month they are raiding Moscow with German bombers. And by the end of September 1941, the Wehrmacht had reached Leningrad, also known as St. Petersburg, which launched a 900-day siege. So here's St. Petersburg, and siege of Leningrad, September 8th of 1941 to January 27th of 1944. That is a heck of a siege. So it's all the way up here on the Baltic, right? Okay. So Stalin, very clearly unprepared. He thought he was safe. And so he had to scramble to halt the advance, and the scramble at the beginning led to 6 million people dying within 6 weeks. So 1 million people killed or captured every week for the first 6 weeks. But in 1942, after kind of collecting themselves, the Soviets started a broad counteroffensive. And the way they're able to do this is because they pulled off mass mobilization pretty miraculously, frankly. So what they were able to do is basically plant their factories over here behind the Ural Mountains, right? The Ural Mountains kind of considered to be the end of Europe geographically. So they were able to put all their factories over here. The Germans could not get there. So they were able to mass produce in those regions of Russia, tanks, aircraft, munitions. And over half the workers in those places were women. But of course, they were working under grueling conditions to supply the Red Army and outproduce the Germans, working around the clock. And by the end of 1942, they were outproducing the Germans. And so this is a big success story for the Soviet industry, which has still been growing at this point, for them to be able to outproduce the Germans, who were historically, since their formation in the 1870s, were historically either number one or number two in industrial production in Europe with Britain. So that's a massive, massive win for the Soviets. Eastern Front, way more brutal than the fighting that the Americans experienced in France, Belgium, Italy, or Germany. And from 1941 on, we see more than 400 Soviet and German divisions battling along 1,000 miles of territory. How many people are in a division? Let's ask. Let's ask the internet. How many people are in a division? 10 to 25,000 soldiers. So if we're looking at 400 just by 10,000, right? We're adding what? We're adding 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros onto there. So 4 million, right? Is that right? Am I getting that good? Yeah. 4 million soldiers on that front, and that's just at the minimum. And Hitler, in effect, commits most of his resources to this, which he's able to do because, again, they had mostly taken over all of continental Europe at that point. The Germans lost 147,000 soldiers who were killed and 91,000 who were captured at the Battle of Stalingrad, the war's largest single battle. And the Germans finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, after 7 months of fighting that left the city in rubble. That city is right here. It's now known as Volgograd. The reason they are going here is that they are using this as an attempt to get into the Ural Mountains and into the oil reserves around the Caspian, so that they can continue to resupply themselves. Basically, they try to cut a line right through here to get access to the Caspian, which this was a massive. If the Soviets lose that battle, that could make the war go on much longer than it did. They also win a tank battle at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, which prompts German retreat, and that is literally just it's thousands of tanks, like thousands, right here. So you can see again, like this, they're pushing them back, right? Just based on the fact that we're at Stalingrad here, Kursk is here, right? They're pushing them back, and in fact, the Battle of Kursk is a big momentum shift, leading the Germans to retreat back into mainland Europe, not in Russia. And by November of 1943, the Soviets had recaptured 2/3 of Axis territory. And then the Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 opened the long-awaited Second Front. So the Soviets had really been hoping for the Second Front to open, frankly, much earlier than this, because it would just take a lot of pressure off of them, and they could probably do a lot better against the Germans on their side. And this allows the Soviets to sweep through Eastern Europe and south of Romania into the Balkans, where the Balkans were also a pretty big stronghold of the Germans and the Italians. Stalin, though, sees this delay as an attempt to weaken the Soviets, an act of hostility against the Soviet Union, essentially hoping that this would weaken the Soviet Union for any post-war war that was going to happen. And by 1945, the Red Army and the Soviet Army is marched into Eastern Germany. And the Americans and British were advancing into Western Germany at the same time. The Soviets entered Berlin in April of 1945. April 30th of that month, Hitler commits suicide, and his commanders surrendered at the Battle of Berlin on May 2nd. And just a week later, May 9th, the Germans officially surrender, ending war in Europe. We see millions of Soviets taking to the streets to celebrate Victory Day, but there are a lot of unresolved questions coming out of World War II. The main concern for Stalin was twofold. Number one, the fate of Germany, what's going to happen to Germany, and then the fate of the Eastern European nations bordering the Soviet Union, because those nations, as we just saw in World War II, right, the Baltic nations, Belarus, Ukraine, had constantly been a avenue into Russia for centuries at this point, and he wanted to end that. And so by the time the Germans surrendered, the Red Army soldiers occupied almost all of Eastern Europe. And Stalin is very determined to make sure the Soviets can't be invaded again. And he's going to use the Soviets' army, the Red Army's position in Eastern Europe, to guarantee that. And again, he has strategic logic here, right? It's trying to protect the Soviet Union. The problem is Stalin, as we're going to see, doesn't want what the British and the Americans want. What the British and Americans want is that they want people free from the Nazis after World War II to have their own elections, their own self-determination and democracy throughout all of Europe, throughout the world, asterisk, British colonies, but especially in Europe. But Stalin doesn't want that, right? He wants to bring some of these countries into the Soviet sphere. And so his control over Eastern Europe is quite problematic and troubling. And we see over several meetings, which is the part of the next section, the Allied leaders will try to hash out their plans for the post-war order. And that's it for this section. Very clearly, the Soviets faced a much, much greater burden in World War II. I think it's, I think if you've studied a little bit of World War II, you probably know a good notion that the Soviets are largely responsible for the victory against the Germans. But living in the United States, I think we kind of get a version of the war that we saved the war, and we did. And fundamentally, us joining this war turns the tide for sure. But the Soviets also turned the tide on their own. Right, and us two in conjunction led to an inevitable defeat for the Nazis in Europe. But even if we hadn't joined the war, I feel like the Soviets were outproducing the Germans. They would have eventually been able to do this on their own. And so, what would happen then, right? Would we have a fully communist Europe, right? That would have been interesting to see. But the Soviets are they wear the Germans out, right? They deplete their resources in trying to defeat them. So yeah, the Soviets bear a lot of the burden and also should get a lot more of the reward for the victory in World War II that I frankly don't think we give them. But at the end of this, that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching.